Hello everyone, I hope everybody have enjoyed your time and took the midterm exam. In this week we are actually going to talk about risk management part and basically how to manage the risk, or the first part we are going to talk about how to identify and assess the risk. And then in the second chapter 7, we are going to talk about how to control those risks. Some of the things that you will learn in this chapter would be that you should be able to define what is a risk management and what is its role in the company. Also, you should be able to describe some of the techniques about risk management in order to identify and basically prioritize the risk factors for the information assets in the company. Also, you should be able to explain how risk is being assessed and basically the effects on information assets, and when that event occurs, how we can assess the risk based on the likelihood of the event that could happen. Also, you should be able to discuss the use of the result of risk identification process, how you can implement a risk management policy in the organization. So let's look at some of the basic things about the risk management. Basically, in our organization, information security is primary responsible to manage the risk to information assets. Managing risk is basically the key responsibility of every manager within an organization. So when you are developing a risk management program, you need to develop a formal, repeatable process that could be defined as a well-developed risk management program. The coverage of risk management in this area, we will include risk identification, risk assessment, risk appetite, and at the end, in chapter 7, we will talk about how to control the risk. And as we said, all the manager in the organization, they should be able to focus on reducing the risk. So let's look at the 3 communities of interest and how they can manage the risk. The general management is one community of interest. They must structure the IT and information security function in such a way that it will result in the successful defense of organization information asset. What do we mean by information asset? That it can include data, hardware, software, procedure, and people in the company. So also the second group that we are going to focus on is the IT management. They should serve the IT needs of the broader organization, and also at the same time they should look at the skills and insight of the information security community. And then the third group that can focus on risk management is information security management. They should lead the way with that skill. They should lead the way with professionalism and flexibility, and they should be able to work with other communities of interest to be able to have a balance between information security, utility, and also the security. Basically, Chinese General Sun Tzu, he basically made the observation about 2,400 years ago. And he said that about the philosophy of information security today, basically. He said that, therefore I say, one who knows the enemy and one knows himself will not be in a danger in 100 battles. One who doesn't know the enemy but knows himself will sometimes win, sometimes lose. One who doesn't know the enemy and doesn't know himself will be in danger in every battle. Basically, when we talk about the information strategy and tactics, we can think about it as a part of a warfare. But information security managers and technicians, they are basically the defenders of the information. So they are defending the information, same as in a battle. And they constantly face a lot of threats to the organization information assets. So, as General Sun Tzu recommends, like a while back ago, in order to reduce the risk, we must first know itself. The company should know itself and also knows its enemy. So these are the two important parts that you are getting from this comment that he made 2,400 years ago. So the company needs to know itself, and also it needs to know its enemy. So first, let's look at knowing yourself, basically knowing the company. When a company operates, a lot of basically risks are always going to be involved. So for an organization to manage the risk properly, managers should also understand how information is being collected, processed, stored, and transmitted. So basically knowing yourself in this context requiring knowing which information assets are valuable to the company. We have to first identify them, then categorize them, and then classify those assets. Then we have to understand how they are being protected currently in the organization. So once we know this knowledge, the organization can basically initiate an in-depth risk management plan. And also, one more thing that I want to note, risk management is a process. So it's not something that it just we install it and then we forget about it. It's something that we need to implement, and then we need to have some control strategies upon it. The second thing that he mentioned, and it's important, is we need to know the enemy. So basically, we need to identify, examine, and understand the threats facing the organization information assets. Also, managers, they should be prepared to fully identify those threats that pose risk to the company and the security of the information assets. Risk management is basically a process of discovering and assessing the risk to an organization operation, and then determining how these risks they can be controlled or mitigated. So all of those communities of interest that we have identified, they should be responsible for managing the risk. So basically, the management of an organization is accountable for the risk management program that they are going to be used. Of the three communities of interest directly linked to managing the risk to information asset, each has a particular strategy and kind of a role to play. Information security group, IT group, and management and user group. So these three communities of interest, they should work together to address every level of risk, ranging from big disaster, whether it could be natural or human-made, to a smaller mistake that has been made by an employee. They actually need to follow certain activities. First, they have to prepare themselves for risk management. Then they have to identify risk, which basically in identifying risk, they have to create an inventory of information asset. They have to be able to classify and organize the asset, assigning a value to each of the information assets. They have to identify the threats, and then they have to pinpoint vulnerable asset by typing a specific threat to a specific assets. They also have to assess the risk, which they need to determine the vulnerability likelihood that the vulnerable system will be attacked by specific threats. They need to assess the relative risk facing the organization information asset. Also, they need to calculate the risk to which asset they are being exposed in the current setting. They need to look in a general way to controls that might come into play for identify vulnerabilities, and they need to document and report the finding of risk identification and assessment. Also, they need to define the organization risk appetite. That includes identifying individual risk tolerance for each information assets. They need to also combine or synthesize these individual risk tolerance into a coherent risk appetite statement. And at the end, they need to be able to evaluate the risk control, which they need to determine which control options are cost effective. They need to acquire or install the appropriate controls that is needed in place, and they need to oversee the process to make sure that the control remain in effect. The second part that we are going to talk about is about risk identification. A risk management process should be well organized and funded. They have to have a clear champion, a statement of work, and all the needed support that's needed from the top managers. So also a team, it needs to be they need to select a team, and they need to be able to conduct some of those tasks in terms of finding the right skilled people in the process. So self-identification actually begins with identification of information assets, and by actually doing a self-examination. So managers, they have to identify those information assets, which includes people, procedure, data, software, hardware, and the networking element. They need to classify and categorize them into useful groups, and then they need to prioritize them by overall importance. So as we said, the risk identification process, it can begin with identifying the information assets, including people, procedure, data, information, software, hardware, and networking elements. This step should be done without prejudging the value of each asset. And then values will be assigned later in the process. So first you need to identify the assets in the company. This table shows a model that shows the identified assets subcategorized into the risk management component. So for instance, we have the information system component as people. The risk management component could be internal personnel or external personnel, and then the example of risk management could be trusted employees, other staff members, people we trust outside or inside the organization. So we are identifying these that could be in part of the risk. For procedures, the risk management component is procedures. Basically, we have both the IT and business standard procedures and IT and business sensitive procedures. The second thing that we are going to discuss is identifying hardware, software, and network assets. Many companies, they use asset inventory system to be able to keep track of their hardware, network, software components. There are a lot of packages that are available, and it's basically up to the information security officer is to determine which package can best serve the company's needs. Company, they shouldn't use a package inventory system. They must create an equivalent manual or automated process. Whether it's automated or manual, the inventory process needs a certain amount of planning that needs to be in place. Determine which attributes of each of these information assets should be tracked. That also will depend on the needs of the company and its risk management effort. When we are deciding which attributes to track for each information asset, we need to have a list of potential attributes. The list could include name, asset tags, that basically you can use to facilitate the tracking of the assets, internal protocol like IP addresses, and this is very useful for network devices and servers in the organization, media access control or MAC address, also asset types. This also describes the function of each asset. For hardware assets, a list of possible asset types could include servers, desktops, networking devices, and test equipment should also needs to be developed. And then serial numbers. This also uniquely identifies each device. The manufacturer name, also the manufacturer model or the part number, and software version, basically updated revision or FCO number. And then also software license data, and physical location, also logical location, which these attributes specify where an asset can be found on the organization network, and then controlling entity, and this refers to the organization unit that controls the assets. In some organization, a remote location on-site staff could be placed in control of the network devices. And in some, maybe a central corporate group, they might be able to control all the network devices. So now let's talk about identifying people, procedures, and data assets. Responsibility for identifying, describing, and evaluating the information asset should be assigned to the manager who possesses the necessary knowledge, experience, and judgment. So the human resources, documentation, and data information assets are not readily identified and documented as software and hardware. So they need to have an experienced manager to be assigned. As these assets are identified, they should be able to record with a reliable data handling process like the one used for the hardware and software as well. So the record-keeping system should be flexible, allowing us to link asset to attributes based on the nature of information assets that is being tracked. Basic attributes could include people, data, procedures. For people, maybe the position name, the ID, maybe the supervisor name, the ID, and security clearance level, also maybe the skills that the people have. For procedure, basically the description, the intended purpose, software, hardware, networking elements that is being used, the location where the procedure documents are being stored, and the location where the documents are stored for updated purposes. And in terms of data, classification, ownership, size of the data structure, the data structure that is being used, sequential or relational, online or offline, basically the location, and some backup procedures. Now let's look at classifying and categorizing the information assets. Once the initial inventory is assembled, we have to determine whether its asset categories are meaningful to the organization risk management program or not. There needs to be a review, and the managers, they need to actually look at it. So maybe they can create new categories if that category doesn't describe it. Maybe, for instance, if the category Internet Components is too general, it can be divided into subcategories of server, networking devices such as router, hubs, and switches, and firewalls and proxies. The inventory should also reflect the sensitivity and security priority assigned to each information asset. A data classification scheme could be developed that categorizes these information assets based on their sensitivity and security needs. Sometimes we might actually have a classification such as confidential, internal, and public. Each of these classification categories designate the level of the protection that's needed for a particular information asset. Some assets types, such as personal, may require some alternative classification schemes. For instance, based on need to know and right to update, an employee might be given a certain level of security clearance, which can identify the level of information that the individual is basically authorized to use. Also, the classification category must be comprehensive and mutually exclusive. Basically, comprehensive means that all inventory's assets fit in a category, and mutually exclusive means that each asset is found in only one category. For example, maybe a company can have a public key infrastructure certificate authority, which is a software application that provides cryptographic key management services. Using a purely technical standard, a manager could categorize the application in the asset list that we talked before as software, a general grouping with no specific classification priority. Now let's look at assessing value in the information assets. So as each information asset is being identified, categorized, and classified, a relative value must also be assigned to each. Relative values are basically comparative judgments that is made to be able to make sure that the most valuable information assets are given the highest priority. For instance, we can think about which information asset is the most critical to the success of the organization, or which information asset can generate the most revenue, or which information asset can generate the highest profitability, or which information asset is the most expensive to replace, and which information asset is most expensive to protect. Also, which information assets loss or compromise would be the most embarrassing or can cause the greatest liability for the company. This is a sample asset classification worksheet which can be used to collect the answers to the list of questions for later analysis. We can also need to identify and add other institution-specific questions to the evaluation process. The final step in the risk identification process is basically to prioritize or rank the asset. This can be achieved by using a weighted table analysis, same to the sample assessment classification scheme. In this process, each information asset is listed in the first column. Then the relevant criteria that the organization wants to use to value the asset is listed in the top row. Next, each criteria is assigned a weight or the value that typically sums to 1, 10, or 100, or some other value that's easy to sum up. The use of these weights is what gives the analysis its name. Next, the company assigns a value to each asset, again using a scale from 0 to 1, 10, or 100, based on a particular value criteria. This table also uses value from 0.1 to 1, and each information asset cell value are multiplied by the criteria weight, and then summed to create the weighted score for the information asset. Sorting the table by the weighted score results in a prioritized list of information assets. So in here, we can see customer order via SSL inbound is the most important asset on this worksheet because the weighted score is the highest, is 100. And then the lowest, and then basically the other one, EDI document set 2, which the score is 41, is the least critical assets. So this concludes the first part of this chapter. In the next part of this chapter, we are going to talk about threat assessment.